Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Today in Mark chapter 9, we read about Jesus having a similar experience to Moses. Both Jesus and Moses go up on a mountain. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai. Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration. Both of them have a wonderful experience there. Moses experienced the very presence of God and the giving of the law and the covenant. Jesus is transfigured before his disciples and has a wonderful mountaintop experience there. But both of them, both Moses and Jesus, come down from the mountain only to find chaos and the people in disarray. Moses comes down and sees the people partying and worshiping a golden calf. Jesus comes down and finds the people in unbelief. He goes down from the mountain and he finds that there was this man who had a son who was demon possessed. They'd taken him to the disciples. The disciples were not able to cast out the demon, and there's just chaos ensuing. And Jesus rebukes them in verse 19 and says, "O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And so Jesus comes down from the mountain and finds unbelief. Moses came down and found calf worship. Jesus comes down and finds unbelief. And he's frustrated by that. You can tell by what he says that he's frustrated by the fact that he came down from the mountain and found this lack of belief. And so this section of the Gospel of Mark deals a lot with faith. And there's a lot that we can learn about faith in connection to this story. And one of the things that we learn is kind of what was just mentioned, that when there is a lack of faith among Jesus's believers and in people in general, there's chaos. When people are not stepping out on faith, when they're not standing on the solid ground of Christ, when they're not entrusting their lives to the power and the working of God, when they're not subjecting themselves to the guidance of God by faith and trusting in the Lord, it leads to chaos. It leads to disarray. It leads to contentions and disagreements and disputes. But when we're all in alignment with one another and we're all joined together in faith, it brings unity and it brings solidarity between God's people. And so one of the things that we learn about faith is that when there's a lack of faith, it oftentimes leads to chaos in that regard. But we also learn that a lack of faith sometimes is really just not really believing that God can do what we would like for him to do. We see this with the boy's father, the boy who was demon-possessed, his father. They brought this demon-possessed boy to him, and the father explains to him, what he had been going through. He'd been thrown into the fire and by the water. This demon was trying to destroy him. But then he says, "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." So this is a symptom of a lack of faith. And that is not believing that God can actually do something in a particular situation. He says, "If you can do something, have pity on us." Jesus recognizes this in verse 23 and says, "If you can, all things are possible to him who believes." And so sometimes the chaos, the lack of cohesion among God's believers, among people of faith, that is caused by people not really expecting God to actually step into the situation, or really even believing that God can do anything in a particular situation. Maybe they just believe that, well, God doesn't do that anymore. Yeah, we read about miracles in the Bible, but God doesn't really demonstrate a lot of power now. He kind of just leaves it up to us. He's got the system running, and now he leaves it up to us to maintain it. And God's not really going to step into various situations and work in that particular situation. We get into this mindset perhaps of, if God could do something, well, then this problem would be fixed. But the assumption is that God won't do anything in the situation. And so that's a symptom of faith when we begin to think that God's not going to help. When we get into this mindset of thinking that God can't really help us, that we're on our own, that we have to figure it out on our own. We got to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and take care of the situation. That is a symptom of a lack of belief. And so this is a problem. Another symptom of a lack of faith is when we don't believe in what God has done in the past, and we don't really translate what he's done in the past to the present situation. And here it relates more with the disciples who were not able to cast out the demon. And that seems to be in connection to their lack of faith or trust in God. And maybe they were just trying to cast it out in their own strength. That seems to be implied when Jesus tells them this kind can only come out by, or this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. Maybe implying that, hey, you guys are trying to do it in your own strength. You've got to pray to God and trust in God to bring this about. But nonetheless, there was some type of lack of faith, it seems to be, with the disciples, which is a bit strange because, the disciples had already been sent out with the power to cast out demons. They had already demonstrated the power of casting out demons. Jesus had given them that gift to do so. They had already gone through the various villages teaching the gospel and exorcising spirits and things like that. But for some reason, in this particular case, they weren't able to do it. And it seems to be tied to a lack of trust in God, maybe in trying to do it in their own self-strength or whatever. But whatever the case may be, it seems to be that they somehow was not taking what they had learned and translating it over to the present situation. And that can be a symptom of a lack of faith when we get into a pressing moment today, and we forget all the times God has been there for us in the past, all the times his power has been demonstrated, all the answered prayers that he has given us, and all the times that he's shown up and really helped us in a situation, whether by fixing the situation or giving us strength to get through the situation. And we forget all that. That's a symptom of a lack of faith. We should remember those wonderful times in which the Lord has demonstrated his power in our lives and realize, you know what? The same God that helped me yesterday is the same God I follow today. And he can help me in this situation just as he did in the past. And so we find yet another symptom of a lack of faith. So a lack of faith basically says, well, God probably can't do anything in this situation. Another symptom is that we forget about the past things that God has done, the past demonstrations of power that he's demonstrated, and we don't bring those over into the present moment. And this leads to the chaos and the disarray, not only in the church, but also just in our day-to-day walk, in our day-to-day lives. We just don't have our minds focused on the Lord, trusting the Lord, relying upon the Lord as we should. And so it leads to this chaos. Well, then we say, well, what's the solution to this? How is it that we can acquire a faith that will help us to get back on the road again, to get back on the path of faith and trusting in the Lord again? Well, one of the things that we have to do is what they didn't do, and that is remember the things that God has done for us in the past. And remember that he has done lots of things for us and that he can help us even in the present situation. But there's more specific things here as well. And one of them is actually demonstrated by the very person that we used as an example of one of the symptoms of unbelief. And he has the right attitude, this person, this father of this boy who had this demon possession. In verse 24, after the Lord says, if you can, anything is possible for him who believes, immediately the boy's father cried out and said, I do believe, help my unbelief. So that's the first thing we can do. If we realize, you know what, my life has been kind of chaotic. I haven't really been stepping out in faith. I haven't been trusting in the Lord. Haven't really been coming to the Lord with expectation. One of the first things we can do is recognize our unbelief and say, yes, I have faith in God, generally speaking, but I also have a part of me that's filled with unbelief. And go to the Lord with that and say, Lord, I do believe in you. I do believe you have power and strength and all those things. Help me in this unbelief. Help me in this particular situation where I seem to be lacking faith. That's our first step, is recognizing our lack of faith and then bringing it to the Lord and asking for help, that the Lord would help us to have the strength that we need in the current situation. But then the other thing we must do is then trust in God and not trust in ourselves. Go to the Lord in prayer, asking for more faith to help our unbelief, but then trust in the Lord. Again, going back to the statement that Jesus said after the disciples said, why could we not drive it out? He said, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. In other words, only God can cast it out. You can't cast it out. You never could do it in your own strength. It was only the time that you cast out demons, it was only because God was doing it through you. And so a reliance upon God, spending time in prayer towards the Lord, and just dedicating ourselves to prayer and trusting God. That's the next step. One, recognizing our unbelief, but then immediately engaging in prayer, seeking the Lord to help us with our unbelief, and then bringing the situation to the Lord in prayer, trusting it to the Lord, and not trusting in ourselves. All of that will begin to cause us to then shift from a state of unbelief to a state of belief, from a state of what's impossible to a state of all things are possible, as I'm turning my eyes to God, the almighty, powerful God who can do all things. So this whole section in Mark chapter 9 ought to help us in our struggle with faith, to help us realize, if we're living a life of unbelief, it leads to chaos. The symptoms of that is when we start beginning to believe that God won't work in this situation, or maybe when we begin to trust in ourselves. And the solution is then to remember all that the Lord has done for us in the past, to recognize our unbelief and go to the Lord in prayer, and then trust the Lord and trust in Him and not in ourselves to accomplish what needs to be done in the present moment. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading in Mark chapter 9. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.